What I'm working on now is fret dressing this guitar and one other. This is a new guitar, so the frets have just been installed. They've got no wear on them, but I just need to go over it and make sure everything's perfectly level, because very occasionally you get one that's close to perfect, but there's usually discrepancies, and they can be as much in the wire as anything else. So I just need to go over it and make sure everything is exactly as it should be. So the first thing I need to do is, before I attack the frets with anything abrasive, is to check that the neck is straight. Now, there's a few different ways I've seen people do this: notch straight edges, a flat straight edge across the top of the frets. But I'm at this stage more interested in how straight the board is than the frets, because the frets could be slightly uneven. So what I do, rather than use a notch straight edge, is use three dowels, three steel dowels, which are actually, it came with various sets of tuners that I had there for installing or removing tuner bushes, but they're all measured up, they're all exactly the same diameter. So what I do is I put one there, and one about there, which is around about in the middle, somewhere like that, pretty close. And then with a regular straight edge, I just put that on there. The neck is supported on a fairly long support, so there's no chance of it flexing. And yeah, I can see that's actually rocking ever so slightly. If I push down on there, so the straight edge is touching that one and that one, you can see that one's loose. So that means the neck is slightly backbowed, which I don't want. If I take all of the tension off the truss rod, we should reach a point where, let me just give that a little nudge just to help it, because the truss rod is quite snug in these. I don't like these things to be loose. So if I've taken that's all the tension off the truss rod, so what we now have is a little bit of forward bow. As you can tell by the fact the straight edge is rolling on the outer two, but that is loose. So we have a little bit of static relief in the neck. So what I can now do is slowly put a little bit of tension on the truss rod, and I like to just keep moving the straight edge backwards and forwards, and you'll see, there we go, it's just starting to pick up that central dowel pin. If I reach about there, then I can just, like a feeler gauge, just get a little bit of feel for, and that's a little looser, that one. So I'll just put a tiny bit more tension on the rod. I reckon that's pretty close to straight. I'll just put a tiny bit more. Yeah, no, that's gone a little bit too far. So I'll slacken that off. Yeah, I'm happy with that now. That's perfectly good. It's touching all three of those points, so I know that's straight. And the reason I can do it with this is because it's a new guitar, and I know the board was true before I put it in. If I was a little bit unsure of the shape of the board, I could always use more pins, which is essentially creating a notch straight edge. I find them a bit awkward, notch straight edges. You've got to get down here and peer through it, and you know, I can get just exactly the same results by doing this. So I'm now confident that that board is straight, it's where I want it to be for fret dressing purposes. So the next stage, before I do anything more aggressive, is to mask the board to protect that from any marker pen which we'll be using, or abrasives or anything like that. So we'll do that, and we'll crack on. I do this fret dressing process sort of midway through the polishing process because this bit of it sticking tape onto the finish, it's less of a concern when the finish isn't fully polished. Once it's fully polished, you've always got the chance that you might scratch it or something, pulling the tape off, or leave a bit of tape residue or something like that. It's never anything serious, but it's just a little bit less of a thing to worry about if you do it at this stage before it's all finally polished. So I'll proceed like this. I use this yellow tape, is a low tack tape, and once we get to about there, I can just use a narrow strip, and I use this all the way up to here, and then where the frets are a bit narrower up the top here, I use vinyl lining tape because it's narrow and I can do that. So I'll carry on with that, and then we'll get to marking up the frets and having a look at that. Okay, so now I've got the fingerboard all taped up and protected. You'll notice one thing, that the guitar has miraculously changed colour during the process. In true Blue Peter style, this is one I prepared earlier. So, but the process is the same. Everything else is identical apart from the colour. So, first thing I like to do is, before I take the majority of the material off, I'll just run through tools that I use. I use a finest quality Stuart McDonald sanding beam. This is, I think, an 18-inch beam. This seems to work best for me. Other people probably use different ones. It's whatever you get comfortable with, really. And I use 400 grit 3M paper, again from Stuart McDonald, stuck to it in a strip there. I also use a little short, this is a plywood block that I make sure is flat by sanding it flat on my surface table at regular intervals. And again, that I can use for more local things. I also use a little tiny one, which will be the first thing that I use. The process basically is you mark the tops of the frets with a marker pen, then run the sanding beam over the top of the frets until the marker is removed from the top of all of them, and that way you've got rid of all of the high ones. But before I do that, rather than just marking all of them and attacking it with the beam, I like to go over it and take down any little high ones locally, because sometimes if you've got sort of a high patch in the middle for some reason, the beam can rock on that and you end up not getting a completely straight finish. So it can be a little bit more time consuming and you end up removing a little bit more material than you need to. So what I like to do is go over the whole fretboard with a fret rocker, a series of little short straight edges, again Stuart McDonald's finest, and just mark out any locally obviously high frets. So and take those down. So I'll start here. Obviously we can't account for whether the first fret is high or not, but because we don't have anything to reference that to. But there's no rocking there. Oh, there's a little bit there, but not there. So that fret, you know, that might sound quite dramatic. It's probably only thousandths of an inch or so. I know that. So that fret there is a little high relative to the others, so I mark that. Then yes. a little bit just through there. It's a bit high. Just a little tiny bit there. That's it. Right. So those black marks are the points where I've got a little bit of excess height relative to the adjacent frets, and that's really not too bad. So what I like to do is deal with those before I go over the whole thing with the long beam. Now, to deal with these little local high areas, I use a little short block, little short flat block, with a little strip of 400 grit paper in the middle, and to the same thickness a couple of pieces of tape. That's 8/1000ths of an inch thick, that abrasive paper, and I make up 8/1000ths out of a couple of strips of tape. So I know that if I run that tape surface over the adjacent frets, the abrasive paper will take that one down locally. So that's the first step to do. So let's do that. We know this is high here, so if I do that, then check that with the fret rocker. Tiny bit, much less than there was. That should be pretty close, I imagine. Just a tiny bit right on the edge. You don't actually at this stage have to be 100% perfect because we're going to go over the whole thing again, but that should take care of that. There we go. No rocking at all. Now we could catch ourselves out. See if that rock's there. No, it doesn't. See if that rock's there, because we've now lowered this third fret, so we'll see how that relates to the fourth. Oh, no, that's good. So that's just turned out that was just a little bit high just through there, and that's no longer high, so that's fine. And we'll repeat the procedure all the way up, taking down all these little local high points, and then what we'll do then is we'll go on and we'll do the whole thing in one go, just to make sure we're flat and everything is flat relative to itself. So we'll proceed with this. Always worth checking as you go. tiny bit more there. You have to be, one thing to pay attention when doing a job like this is that is the orientation of your straight edge, because if you're looking to see which fret is high, and if you angle it too much like this, then it will appear high because of the curvature of the board. It will appear high, so you do need to keep it either completely straight along the axis of the guitar, or I like to just angle it ever so slightly on the string line. That way I know that there are no issues, and that's fine. That's good. So there's just a couple more little bits to take care of. The 400 grit paper doesn't last forever, but it's relatively inexpensive. So here we go. That's done that. So just a little bit more on there. It's a little bit fiddlier when you've got the frets are closer together here. I reckon we're probably, so let's do a little bit more there. Good, happy with that. So now I've dealt with all those little local high frets, I'm pretty confident that'll be quite good. So in order to double check and make sure everything is as it should be, I'll go over it with the long beam. Before I do that, I'll mark the top of all of the frets with a marker pen. So we have a reference and we can see how we're going. Right, I like to leave that for a minute or two just to make sure it's all dry. It dries pretty quickly, but I just like to make sure it's on there and dry before I do the next stage. So now I've got the fret tops all marked up with the marker pen. I've got a fresh strip of 400 grit paper stuck to the sanding beam. I'm ready to go. So let's do it. Now, rather than run this completely straight up and down, I tend to sort of fan it across to follow the line of the strings. So I guess that possibly introduces a bit of a compound radius. I've never really measured it. It would be microscopic if it was there, but it just seems to be sensible to me, being as the strings follow a certain path, to follow that as much as possible. I imagine it's probably fractions of a thousandth of an inch, whichever way you do it, so it's probably not that much of an issue. So let's make sure that everything is seated flat, everything's nice and square, and then I just simply go like this. Very light, very low pressure. One single pass across, and then I'm going to need my visor for this just to double check. And I can see it's touched the first, it's touched the second, third, fourth is good, fifth is good, sixth is just touched. That still needs a fraction there. What's that? The eighth. There we're good. There we're good. And we're still a little low here, but that's fine. That's absolutely fine. That's no problem. So what I'll do is I'll just give it another. Again, I'm keeping the sanding beam because this is the frets are radiused like that. I tend to try and keep it square to the to the radius, so I'm not sort of rocking and rolling it. It's sort of, so I'm sanding in a point line. Just a single pass across. And where was it? That one. It was just there. It was a bit low, wasn't it? No, we've touched all of that, and we've touched all of the frets, apart from about the 19th onwards. But that's good. That's good. I'm not at all unhappy with that, because next process, it's worth paying a little bit of attention at this time, just to make sure you haven't got any little local bits. Just a tiny bit there I seem to have missed. Not sure where that is, but I think it's worth another go. So what I'll do is just clean that off, and I'll just have one more pass. There, that I know is going to be absolutely fine. Yep, I've touched all of the fret tops. I've taken off a tiniest fraction, and we've touched all of the fret tops. Yep, except for I think the tiny bit on the 22nd fret, but that is absolutely fine, because the next process is to introduce a little bit of fall away, which essentially means a little bit of a drop off in height of the frets, which I do from the 12th fret through to the 22nd here, which just allows for the way the neck curves and the relative stiffness of this part of the neck here around the joint compared with this part. As the string tension pulls the neck forward, this part, this central part, will tend to curve, whereas this part is stiff, and you can end up with an uneven curve, and you can end up with effectively a bit of a bump. You don't end up with a nice curve. So in order to ensure that this part, this here, matches up with the curvature of the neck, and you don't get a sort of, they're not high frets, but they will appear high when the neck is in its playing position. I just lower these ever so slightly from the 22nd through to the 12th. It's very slight, but it just allows it to play a little bit cleaner up the high end. So to do that, that's a couple of stages in that process. First thing I do is I use the same beam, and I get a strip of tape. This tape is about 5 thousandths of an inch thick. And I stick that on my sanding beam. From there, I've got a line mark there, which is, I guess, about a third of the way along. And when I use it, effectively raises that up, so the beam is running at an angle as opposed to being flat along the frets. And then what I'll do is I'll remark the tops of all the higher frets. Should have done that the other way really, because I'm now about to put my hand over the frets I've marked. But, careful, that will be okay. So that's the 12th. I go beyond the 12th a little bit. I'm not going to mark all of them, but that will give me an idea of where I'm working and where I'm not. So now that's done, I do exactly the same procedure, but with the sanding beam canted at an ever so slight angle. It's microscopic. The amount we'll be taking off these high frets is very small, but nonetheless it does work. So we'll do that. And again, to start with, very light pass. You can see I've touching the higher frets here. We haven't quite gone up to the 12th fret. You can see that's all still black there. So you can see the angle is having an effect. So we'll keep going with that. Again, following the curvature of the neck. And for this, I put a little bit of, I'm putting pressure down on here. And so there's no pressure on there, just to make sure all the material is being removed up this higher end. So now we've reached, again, we've not touched any of these frets here. See the black marker is still there. But we're up here to the sort of 14th. We're just kissing the 13th and a hair on the 12th. So at that point, I shall stop with this and I'll go to this shorter. It's probably, what's that, about 8 inches? Let's guess. Let's measure. Let's guess at 8 and measure it. That's actually 8.5 inches. There we go. Or approximately 217 millimeters. Arrived at by, this was probably the length of the piece of wood that I had. So what I then do, I don't bother remarking. I been careful not to mark the body. I start here over the first 3 frets, and I do those, and then move up a fret, and I keep it. I'm keeping the pressure of it so it's down flat, and then I just keep gradually moving up. One fret at a time. Until all of the marker is removed. All the way up to the 13th fret. It's just kissing the 12th there, that's fine. I'll stop there. So, and then one last thing I do is, this is a fairly flat radius. This is an exact 12-inch radius, so there aren't really any issues with string choking, which you can get with a tighter radius, a 7.5-inch radius or something like that. But what I do, just to absolutely make sure, is I just do a little bit of a little bit of a V shape, if you like, which sort of starts here in the middle of the 13th fret and fans out, just to sort of remove a little bit of material out here, so that as the strings are bent up at this high end, they're running into a flatter area rather than up the ramp of the fret. So you're effectively introducing a very localized and very tiny compound radius, just to flatten out just this area here. So, and I do this by feel, really. It's very little material I'm removing. Just, you know, I suppose it's more than a thousandth, 2/1000ths of an inch, I don't suppose. So that, from my experience, will work well. I don't have measurements, I don't have dimensions for how and what, how much fall away I put on the higher frets. I just know that using this system on these necks works. It works. I mean, I know how stiff these necks are. I know the shape that they become when they're under tension, and I know that following this process, it will play completely cleanly everywhere with absolutely no issue. So beyond that, there isn't really anything that you need to know. People can worry about, well, is all the frets exactly the same height, and how much fall away is there? Well, there are ways of doing that, but to be honest, beyond the fact that it works perfectly, I'm not that concerned about that. So, you know, if it works perfectly, then that's really the only thing that anyone need worry about. But it's certainly all I'm going to worry about. So at this stage, we've got the frets where we need them to be. The height of the frets relative to each other is the important thing. The exact height above the board is less of an issue, because the board could easily be worn. I mean, you could have a scalloped board, which, you know, could be different heights all over the place. So as long as the frets are even across the top and where we need them to be, then I'm happy. So the next thing we need to do is to take care of the little localized flat spot on the top of the fret. Some of these we've barely kissed. We've removed effectively no material at all, but nonetheless we need to go over them all and make sure all the crowns of the frets are nice and rounded, as opposed to having a big flat spot on the top. So to do that, first we must remark the top of the frets. So I must get through quite a lot of marker pens.